The fluorescent lights hummed quietly in the basement of St. Mary's General Hospital as Dr. Margaret Chen finished organizing the last of her paperwork. It was nearly midnight on March 15, 1981, and the pathology department felt especially quiet. Most people avoided the morgue during the day, let alone at this late hour, but Margaret had always been comfortable here among the silence and sterile equipment. At 34 years old, Margaret was one of the most respected pathologists in Chicago. She had worked at St. Mary's for 8 years, building a reputation for thoroughness and dedication that few could match. Her colleagues often joked that she knew every corner of the hospital better than the janitors who had worked there for decades. Margaret would smile at these comments, but she took pride in her attention to detail. In her line of work, missing, even the smallest detail could mean the difference between solving a case and leaving families without answers. Tonight had been particularly busy. 3 cases had come in during her shift, and Margaret had worked methodically through each one. She always stayed late when necessary, never rushing through her examinations. Her husband Robert had learned long ago not to wait up for her on nights like these. He understood that Margaret's work was more than just a job to her. It was a calling. As Margaret gathered her things, she noticed something odd about the inventory sheets she had been reviewing earlier. The numbers didn't add up the way they should have. Several tissue samples that were supposed to be sent to research facilities seemed to be missing from the records. It wasn't the first time she had noticed these discrepancies, but tonight the pattern was becoming clearer. Margaret made a mental note to investigate further tomorrow. She had always been meticulous about record keeping, and inconsistencies like these bothered her. In the medical field, especially in pathology, accurate records weren't just important for administrative purposes, they were crucial for families, seeking answers and for advancing medical knowledge. She turned off the lights in her office and walked through the familiar corridors of the basement level. The hospital's basement had been built in 1963, and despite several renovations over the years, it still maintained that old institutional feeling. The walls were painted a pale green color that had probably seemed modern 20 years ago, but now just looked dated. Margaret's footsteps echoed softly as she made her way toward the staff exit. The security guard at the front desk waved as she passed. Charlie Williams had been working the night shift for 15 years and knew most of the late-night staff by name. He was reading a paperback novel, something about cowboys, and barely looked up as Margaret signed out on the log sheet. The time read 11:47 p.m. Margaret pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the cool March air. Chicago winters were finally giving way to spring, but the nights were still chilly. She pulled her coat tighter as she walked across the mostly empty parking lot toward her white Honda Civic. The car had been a practical choice when she bought it 2 years ago. Reliable, fuel-efficient, and perfect for her daily commute from the suburban home she shared with Robert. What happened next would puzzle investigators for years to come. Margaret reached her car and apparently unlocked the door without any trouble. The security camera mounted on the parking garage captured her approaching the vehicle at 11:52 p.m. But that was the last clear image anyone would have of Dr. Margaret Chen. The next morning, hospital staff arriving for the early shift noticed something strange. A white Honda Civic was sitting in the parking lot with its engine running and the driver's door wide open. Steam rose from the exhaust pipe in the cold morning air, and the car had obviously been running all night. When security approached the vehicle, they found Margaret's purse scattered on the asphalt next to the car. Her wallet was nearby. Credit cards and driver's license spilled across the pavement. Most shocking of all, her gold wedding ring lay glinting in the morning sunlight just a few feet from the open car door. Hospital Administrator Helen Rodriguez immediately called the police. She had known Margaret for years and knew that the dedicated doctor would never simply abandon her car and disappear. Margaret was the type of person who always called if she was going to be late, who never missed appointments, and who treated her responsibilities with the utmost seriousness. Detective Ray Morrison arrived at the scene within 30 minutes. A 20-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, Morrison had seen plenty of missing person cases, but this one struck him as particularly unusual from the start. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no obvious evidence of violence. It was as if Margaret had simply vanished into thin air. Morrison interviewed everyone who had been at the hospital that night. Charlie Williams, the security guard, remembered Margaret leaving at her usual time and seeming perfectly normal. The few nurses and doctors who had been working late shifts all confirmed that Margaret had appeared to be in good spirits. No one had noticed anything unusual or suspicious. The detective organized search teams that combed through every inch of the hospital and the surrounding area. They checked empty rooms, storage closets, stairwells, and maintenance areas. They searched the parking garage, nearby streets, and even the hospital's basement tunnels. Nothing turned up any trace of Margaret Chen. Robert Chen was understandably distraught when police informed him of his wife's disappearance. The couple had been married for 6 years and, according to Robert, had no serious problems in their relationship. Margaret had been looking forward to a vacation they had planned for later that spring. She had been excited about a new research project at work. There was absolutely nothing in her behavior or circumstances that suggested she might want to disappear. As days turned into weeks, the case began to consume Detective Morrison. He followed up on every tip that came in, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Someone thought they had seen Margaret at a bus station in Milwaukee. Another caller claimed to have spotted her at a shopping mall in Indiana. Every lead was investigated thoroughly, but none led anywhere meaningful. The case attracted significant media attention. Margaret's photo appeared on the front page of the Chicago Tribune and on local television news broadcasts. The story of the dedicated doctor who had simply vanished captured the public's imagination. Tips poured in from across the country, but despite the widespread coverage and intensive investigation, no solid clues emerged. After 6 months of tireless investigation, the case officially went cold. Detective Morrison never stopped believing that someday the truth would surface. But with no new evidence and no credible leads, there was little more the police could do. Margaret Chen was presumed dead, another unsolved case in the files of the Chicago Police Department. What nobody knew was that the answer to Margaret's disappearance lay much closer than anyone had imagined. In the months following Margaret Chen's disappearance, St. Mary's General Hospital struggled to return to normal operations. The pathology department felt empty without Margaret's dedicated presence, and her colleagues found it difficult to concentrate on their work. Every time someone walked down the basement corridors where Margaret had spent so many hours, they were reminded of that terrible night in March. Dr. Richard Holbrook, who had been the morgue supervisor, seemed particularly affected by Margaret's disappearance. He had worked closely with her for several years, and often mentioned to other staff members how much he missed her expertise and attention to detail. Holbrook was a 15-year veteran of the hospital, well respected for his knowledge of morgue procedures and his ability to train new staff members. 3 weeks after Margaret's disappearance, Holbrook surprised everyone by announcing his resignation. He explained to hospital administration that his elderly mother in Florida had suffered a stroke and needed full-time care. The timing seemed unfortunate, coming so soon after losing Margaret. But family emergencies couldn't be predicted or postponed. Holbrook's colleagues organized a small farewell gathering, and he left Chicago within a few days of his last shift. The hospital had to quickly find replacements for both Margaret and Holbrook. Dr. Patricia Flynn was hired as the new chief pathologist, bringing with her an impressive background from Johns Hopkins Hospital. A new morgue supervisor, David Park, was promoted from within the hospital's existing staff. Both newcomers were competent professionals, but it took time for the department to regain its rhythm. Robert Chen tried his best to rebuild his life, but the uncertainty surrounding his wife's fate made it nearly impossible to find closure. He continued living in their suburban home for 2 years, hoping against hope that Margaret might somehow return. Friends and family members encouraged him to consider the possibility that she was gone forever, but Robert couldn't bring himself to accept that reality without knowing what had actually happened to her. In 1983, Robert finally made the difficult decision to sell the house and move to a smaller apartment closer to downtown Chicago. The memories in their former home had become too painful, and he needed a fresh start. He packed away Margaret's belongings, carefully, unable to throw anything away but needing to create some distance from the constant reminders of their life together. Meanwhile, Detective Morrison continued to receive occasional tips about the case. but none provided any new insights. Every few months, he would pull out Margaret's file and review the evidence once more, hoping to spot something he had missed previously. The case had become personal for him, and he often told colleagues that Margaret Chen's disappearance was the one investigation he most regretted being unable to solve. The hospital itself underwent significant changes during the 1980s. A major renovation project in 1985 updated many of the patient rooms and modernized several departments. The basement level, including the pathology department, received new flooring and fresh paint. The old pale green walls were replaced with a more modern beige color scheme that made the basement feel less institutional and more welcoming. During the renovation, workers discovered that the basement's layout was more complex than many people realized. The building had been constructed in sections over several decades, and there were numerous small storage areas and utility spaces that weren't regularly used. Some of these spaces had been sealed off over the years as the hospital's infrastructure needs changed. Most staff members were unaware of these hidden areas, which were accessible only to maintenance workers and a few long-term employees who remembered the building's original layout. In 1987, 5 years after Margaret's disappearance, Robert made another major life change. He met Linda Walsh, a nurse who worked at a different hospital across town. Linda was kind, understanding, and patient with Robert's slow process of moving forward from his traumatic loss. Their relationship developed gradually, and after 2 years of dating, they decided to marry. The wedding was a small private ceremony attended only by close family and friends. Robert had considered moving away from Chicago entirely, but Linda had deep roots in the city, and he had come to realize that running away from the location wouldn't erase his memories or answer his questions about Margaret's fate. Instead, he chose to honor Margaret's memory while building a new life with Linda. Robert and Linda eventually decided to move to Seattle, where Linda had been offered a position at a prestigious medical center. The move represented a fresh start for both of them, and Robert was ready to put some physical distance between himself and the painful memories of Margaret's disappearance. Before leaving Chicago in 1987, Robert visited Detective Morrison one final time to thank him for his efforts and to ask that he be notified if any new information about Margaret's case ever surfaced. Back at St. Mary's Hospital, the pathology department had settled into its new normal. Dr. Flynn had proven to be an excellent chief pathologist, and David Park had grown into his role as morgue supervisor. The tragic mystery of Margaret Chen's disappearance had become part of the hospital's history, a story that older staff members would occasionally share with newcomers. In 1993, the hospital underwent another renovation project, this time focusing on updating the building's electrical and plumbing systems. The basement received new lighting and improved ventilation, making it a more pleasant working environment. Several small storage rooms were converted into offices, and the layout of the pathology department was modified to improve workflow efficiency. During this renovation, workers again encountered some of the building's unusual architectural features. The original construction in 1963 had included various utility spaces and access panels that had been sealed off over the years. Most of these areas were small and cramped, suitable only for housing electrical equipment or plumbing connections. The renovation team updated the building's blueprints to reflect the current layout, but many of the original architectural details were simply noted as sealed utility space, without much investigation into their exact contents or dimensions. By the mid-1990s, technology was beginning to change the way pathology work was conducted. Computer systems were being introduced to help with record keeping and case management. The hospital administration decided that a complete modernization of the pathology department would be necessary to keep pace with advances in medical technology and to improve efficiency. Plans were drawn up for a comprehensive renovation that would transform the basement level into a state-of-the-art pathology center. The project would include new examination rooms, modern equipment, improved storage systems, and better workflow design. The renovation was scheduled to begin in the spring of 1997, and hospital staff were excited about the improvements it would bring. None of them could have imagined what the construction workers would discover when they began tearing down the old walls. The morning of June 12, 1997, started like any other construction day at St. Mary's General Hospital. The pathology department renovation project was in its second week, and the workers had settled into a steady rhythm of demolition and removal. The basement level buzzed with the sounds of hammers, power tools, and heavy equipment as the old morgue was systematically dismantled to make way for modern facilities. Jake Martinez had been working construction for 12 years, and he had seen just about everything you could expect to find when tearing down old buildings. Forgotten treasures, outdated equipment, newspaper clippings used as insulation, and occasionally some unpleasant surprises like mold or pest infestations. But Jake approached each job with professional curiosity, never knowing what piece of history might be hidden behind the next wall. His partner on this particular morning was Tommy Sullivan, a younger guy who had been in construction for about 5 years. Tommy was eager and hardworking, though he sometimes got squeamish when they encountered anything too gross during demolition work. The two men worked well together, with Jake's experience balancing Tommy's enthusiasm. Their assignment for the day was to remove the interior walls in the main examination room of the old morgue. This room had been the centerpiece of the pathology department for over 30 years, where countless examinations had been conducted and important medical discoveries had been made. The walls were solid construction, built to last, and removing them required careful work with sledgehammers and pry bars. Jake started working on the wall behind what had been the main examination table. The wall appeared to be standard construction, with drywall over metal studs, but as he began breaking through the surface, he noticed that the space behind seemed deeper than expected. Most interior walls in buildings like this were only a few inches thick, but his sledgehammer was penetrating much farther than normal. Tommy was working on the opposite side of the room, focused on removing electrical fixtures and cleaning up debris. The sound of Jake's sledgehammer provided a steady rhythm that had become familiar background noise during their weeks of demolition work. Neither man was particularly concerned about the extra depth Jake was encountering. Old buildings often had unusual construction features that didn't match modern standards. After about 20 minutes of steady work, Jake's sledgehammer broke through into what was clearly an empty space. The tool disappeared completely through the wall, and Jake could feel that there was a significant cavity behind the drywall. This was more unusual than the typical construction surprises they encountered, and Jake called Tommy over to take a look. The two men carefully expanded the hole, using their tools to remove larger sections of drywall and expose the hidden space behind the wall. As they worked, both men began to notice an unpleasant smell emerging from the opening. It wasn't the typical musty odor you might expect from a sealed space in an old building. This smell was different, more organic and disturbing. Tommy stepped back from the wall, covering his nose with his shirt. He had always been sensitive to bad smells, and whatever was coming from behind that wall was making him feel sick. Jake, who had encountered various unpleasant odors during his construction career, continued working to enlarge the opening, but even he was beginning to feel concerned about what they might find. As more of the wall came down, the smell became stronger and more distinct. Both men recognized it now, though neither wanted to say what they were thinking. It was the unmistakable odor of decomposition, something that had been sealed away for a very long time. Jake grabbed a flashlight from his tool belt and shined it into the dark space behind the wall. The hidden area was larger than either man had expected, roughly 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. It appeared to be some kind of utility space or access area that had been sealed off and forgotten. But what Jake saw in the beam of his flashlight made him step back quickly and grab Tommy's arm. There, sitting against the back wall of the hidden space, were human remains. The skeleton was still partially clothed in what appeared to be a white lab coat. Even after all these years, the distinctive shape and color of the medical garment were unmistakable. More shocking still, there was an identification badge attached to the coat, though it was heavily deteriorated and difficult to read clearly. Both men immediately stopped what they were doing and stepped away from the wall. Jake, despite his years of experience, had never encountered anything like this during a construction project. Tommy was visibly shaken, sitting down on a nearby tool box and trying to process what they had just discovered. Jake's first instinct was to call their supervisor, but he quickly realized that this situation required immediate contact with law enforcement. He used his cell phone to call 911, explaining to the dispatcher that they had discovered human remains during a construction project at St. Mary's General Hospital. The dispatcher assured him that police and emergency medical personnel would be dispatched immediately. While they waited for authorities to arrive, Jake and Tommy secured the area and prevented anyone else from entering the room. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the construction crew and hospital staff, and soon a small crowd had gathered in the corridor outside the morgue. Hospital security arrived within minutes to help control access to the scene. Detective Williams, who had been Morrison's partner during the original investigation of Margaret Chen's disappearance, was among the first law enforcement officers to arrive at the scene. She had been promoted to detective sergeant in the years since the Chen case, but she remembered the investigation clearly. When she saw the white lab coat and the partial identification badge, her heart began racing with the possibility that they had finally found Margaret Chen. The medical examiner's team worked carefully to document the scene before removing the remains. Photography, measurements, and evidence collection took several hours, but the team was thorough in their documentation. The identification badge, though severely deteriorated, was readable enough to confirm what Detective Williams had suspected. Dr. Minlu Chen, pathology. As news of the discovery spread throughout the hospital, older staff members who had worked with Margaret began sharing their memories of the dedicated pathologist who had vanished 16 years earlier. Many of them had wondered over the years what had happened to their colleague, and the revelation that she had been hidden in the basement all along was both shocking and heartbreaking. The construction project was immediately halted while investigators processed the scene. The hidden space where Margaret's remains were found appeared to have been some kind of utility access area from the building's original construction in 1963. The space had been sealed off at some point, probably during one of the building's renovations, and had been completely forgotten by current staff members. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the position of the remains. Margaret appeared to have been sitting upright against the back wall of the space when she died. The medical examiner noted scratch marks on the interior walls, suggesting that she had been alive when placed in the sealed space and had desperately tried to escape. The revelation that Margaret Chen had been hidden in the basement of her own workplace all these years sent shockwaves through the medical community and captured national media attention. But for Detective Williams, the discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had Margaret ended up in that hidden space? Who had sealed her inside? And why had someone gone to such elaborate lengths to hide her body? The investigation, that had been cold for 16 years, was suddenly very much alive again. The discovery of Margaret Chen's remains after 16 years sent shockwaves through both the hospital and the Chicago Police Department. Detective Williams found herself leading one of the most unusual cases of her career, investigating a crime that had occurred when she was still a junior officer and had remained hidden for more than a decade and a half. The medical examiner's preliminary findings painted a grim picture of Margaret's final days. The examination revealed that she had died from dehydration and starvation, likely within 3 to 5 days of being sealed in the hidden space. The scratch marks on the walls told the story of someone who had fought desperately to escape, clawing at the surfaces until her strength gave out. It was a conclusion that made everyone involved in the case feel sick to their stomachs. Williams immediately reached out to Detective Morrison, who had since retired but remained deeply interested in the case that had haunted him for years. Despite being officially retired, Morrison offered to assist with the investigation in any way possible. His institutional knowledge of the original case and his familiarity with the hospital's staff from 1981 would prove invaluable. The investigation team began by re-examining every piece of evidence from the original case. They interviewed hospital staff members who had worked with Margaret, reviewed security footage from 1981, and studied the building's architectural plans to understand how someone could have known about the hidden utility space. One of the most important discoveries came from Margaret's personal effects, which Robert had carefully preserved before moving to Seattle. Among her papers at home, investigators found a notebook containing detailed observations about discrepancies in the morgue's inventory system. Margaret had been tracking missing tissue samples and organs that were supposed to be sent to research facilities but had somehow disappeared from the hospital's records. The notebook revealed that Margaret had been conducting her own informal investigation into what appeared to be a systematic theft of biological materials from the morgue. She had documented specific cases where organs or tissue samples had been removed during examinations but had never reached their intended destinations. The notes showed that Margaret suspected someone with access to the morgue was selling these materials on the black market. This discovery completely changed the direction of the investigation. What had initially appeared to be a random crime or personal attack was now clearly connected to Margaret's work and her investigation into criminal activity at the hospital. Someone had killed her to prevent her from exposing their illegal operation. Williams and her team began focusing on hospital staff members who had worked in the pathology department in 1981 and had detailed knowledge of the building's layout. The hidden utility space where Margaret's body was found was not common knowledge. It would have required someone familiar with the building's original blueprints or someone who had worked there during the early years of construction. The investigation revealed that the utility space had been created during the hospital's original construction in 1963 as an access point for electrical systems. It had been sealed off during a renovation in 1978 when the electrical infrastructure was updated and the space was no longer needed. Very few people would have known about its existence or location. As investigators compiled a list of hospital employees who met these criteria, one name kept appearing at the top of their list: Dr. Richard Holbrook, the former morgue supervisor who had abruptly left his position just 3 weeks after Margaret's disappearance. Holbrook had worked at St. Mary's for 15 years before his sudden departure in 1981. He would have had intimate knowledge of the building's layout, unrestricted access to all areas of the morgue, and the authority to remove biological materials without raising immediate suspicion. His timing in leaving the hospital so soon after Margaret's disappearance was particularly suspicious. The investigation team began the process of tracking down Holbrook, who had supposedly moved to Florida to care for his elderly mother. What they discovered was that Holbrook had indeed relocated to Florida, but not for the reasons he had claimed. Hospital records from 1981 showed that Holbrook had never filed any paperwork requesting family leave or indicating that he had a family emergency. Further investigation revealed that Holbrook had purchased a waterfront condominium in Fort Lauderdale just 6 months after leaving Chicago, paying cash for the property despite his modest hospital salary. Bank records showed several large deposits into his accounts during the months leading up to Margaret's disappearance, deposits that were far larger than his regular paychecks. Williams and Morrison traveled to Florida to interview Holbrook, who was now 68 years old and living comfortably in his beachfront home. When they knocked on his door and identified themselves as Chicago police officers investigating Margaret Chen's death, the color drained from Holbrook's face. Initially, Holbrook claimed to have no knowledge of what had happened to Margaret beyond what he had heard about her disappearance. He insisted that his departure from Chicago had been motivated purely by family concerns, and that any suggestion otherwise was ridiculous. However, as the interview continued and investigators presented evidence of his financial irregularities and the timing of his departure, Holbrook's story began to fall apart. The breakthrough came when Williams presented Holbrook with copies of Margaret's notebook and her documentation of the missing biological materials. Faced with evidence that Margaret had been investigating the very crimes he had been committing, Holbrook's composure finally cracked. After several hours of questioning, Holbrook admitted to running an illegal operation selling organs and tissue samples to private research facilities and medical schools that were willing to pay premium prices for biological materials without asking too many questions about their sources. The operation had been extremely profitable, generating tens of thousands of dollars over several years. Holbrook explained that he had been careful to select materials from cases where the families were unlikely to request detailed information about the examination process. He had falsified paperwork and manipulated inventory records to cover his tracks. Believing that his scheme was virtually undetectable, everything had been going smoothly until Margaret began her own investigation into the inventory discrepancies. Her attention to detail and thorough record-keeping had allowed her to spot patterns that others had missed. Holbrook realized that Margaret was getting close to exposing his operation, and that her discovery would result in criminal charges and the end of his career. On the night of March 15, 1981, Margaret had confronted Holbrook with her findings. She had demanded that he explain the missing materials and had threatened to report her suspicions to hospital administration and law enforcement if he couldn't provide satisfactory answers. In a moment of panic, Holbrook had convinced Margaret to follow him to the hidden utility space, claiming that he wanted to show her where stolen materials might be hidden. Once Margaret was inside the narrow space, Holbrook had quickly sealed the opening, believing that no one would ever think to look for her there. Holbrook admitted that he had never intended to kill Margaret, but had acted impulsively to protect himself from exposure. He claimed that he had expected someone to find her quickly, but as days passed and no discovery was made, he realized that Margaret was going to die in the sealed space. Rather than confess or attempt to rescue her, Holbrook had chosen to maintain his silence and proceed with his plan to leave Chicago. He had used his accumulated profits from the illegal organ sales to start a new life in Florida, believing that Margaret's body would never be found and that suspicion would never fall on him. The confession provided the closure that Margaret's family and friends had been seeking for 16 years, but it also revealed the horrific nature of her death and the callous calculations that had led to her murder. The confession of Dr. Richard Holbrook sent ripples through the medical community and brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief to everyone who had known Margaret Chen. After 16 years of uncertainty, the truth was finally known, but the reality of how Margaret had died was almost too horrible to comprehend. Detective Williams worked closely with prosecutors to build the strongest possible case against Holbrook. The evidence was substantial. His financial records showing unexplained large deposits, his suspicious departure from Chicago immediately after Margaret's disappearance, his intimate knowledge of the hospital's layout, and most importantly, his detailed confession describing exactly how he had lured Margaret to her death. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once Holbrook was extradited from Florida back to Chicago. His defense attorney attempted to argue that the confession had been coerced and that the evidence was circumstantial, but the prosecution had built an airtight case. The timeline of events, the financial evidence, and Holbrook's own words painted a clear picture of premeditated murder committed to cover up an ongoing criminal enterprise. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence of Holbrook's illegal organ trafficking operation, which had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years. Expert witnesses testified about the black market for biological materials and how someone in Holbrook's position could have easily manipulated hospital records to conceal his crimes. The most powerful testimony came from colleagues who had worked with Margaret and could speak to her character and her dedication to ethical medical practice. They described a woman who would never have ignored evidence of criminal activity and who would have felt morally obligated to report any wrongdoing. She discovered Robert Chen, now living in Seattle with his second wife Linda, traveled back to Chicago to attend the trial. Seeing the man who had killed his first wife was emotionally devastating, but Robert felt he needed to be present to represent Margaret's memory and to see that justice was served. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on charges of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit fraud. The judge sentenced Holbrook to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting the particularly cruel and calculating nature of the crime. In his sentencing statement, the judge observed that Holbrook had not only taken Margaret's life, but had also stolen 16 years of closure from her family and friends. The decision to seal Margaret in the utility space and allow her to die slowly demonstrated a level of callousness that warranted the harshest possible punishment. Following the trial, St. Mary's General Hospital implemented comprehensive new oversight procedures for their pathology department. The hospital administration worked with law enforcement to review all of their inventory and record-keeping systems to ensure that nothing similar could happen in the future. They also established new protocols requiring multiple staff members to verify the handling and disposition of all biological materials. The hospital created a memorial garden in Margaret's honor, recognizing her dedication to medical ethics and her ultimate sacrifice in pursuing the truth. The garden became a place where staff members could reflect on the importance of integrity in medical practice and remember a colleague who had died defending those principles. Detective Morrison, despite his retirement, attended every day of the trial. The case had haunted him for his entire career, and seeing it finally resolved provided a sense of closure he had never expected to experience. In interviews after the verdict, Morrison emphasized that cold cases are never truly closed, and that advances in investigative techniques can sometimes bring justice even decades after a crime has been committed. The case attracted national media attention as an example of how construction and renovation projects can sometimes reveal long-buried secrets. Several documentaries and news programs featured the story, highlighting both the tragic nature of Margaret's death and the perseverance of investigators who never gave up on finding the truth. For the staff at St. Mary's Hospital, the resolution of Margaret's case brought an end to 16 years of wondering and speculation. Many employees had developed their own theories about what might have happened to the dedicated pathologist, but none had imagined the reality of her situation. The knowledge that she had been trapped in the basement all along, just feet away from her colleagues, was deeply disturbing to everyone who worked there. The hidden utility space where Margaret's remains were found was permanently sealed and converted into a memorial space within the hospital's new pathology center. A plaque was installed commemorating Margaret's life and work, ensuring that her sacrifice would not be forgotten by future generations of medical professionals. Robert Chen was finally able to lay his first wife to rest in a proper ceremony. The funeral, held at the same church where Robert and Margaret had been married, was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Margaret's work and character. Colleagues from the hospital, former patients' families, and members of the medical community came together to honor a woman whose commitment to truth had ultimately cost her life. In his eulogy, Robert spoke about Margaret's unwavering integrity and her belief that the truth was always worth pursuing, regardless of the personal cost. He noted that even in death, Margaret had continued to serve the cause of justice by providing the evidence needed to convict her killer and expose the criminal operation that had led to her murder. The Margaret Chen case became a landmark example of how determination and new investigative techniques can solve even the most challenging cold cases. Detective Williams was promoted and became a specialist in cold case investigations, often citing Margaret's case as an example of why investigators should never give up hope. The story of Dr. Margaret Chen serves as a reminder that the pursuit of truth and justice sometimes requires tremendous sacrifice. Her dedication to uncovering the truth about the missing biological materials at St. Mary's Hospital ultimately cost her life, but it also led to the exposure of a significant criminal operation and ensured that similar crimes would be much more difficult to commit in the future. 16 years after her disappearance, Margaret Chen finally received the justice she deserved, and her killer was held accountable for one of the most calculated and cruel crimes in Chicago's history. The case demonstrated that even when criminals believe they have committed the perfect crime, the truth has a way of eventually coming to light.